Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's office hours. My name is Scott Wheeler. I'm a support engineer here at CircleCI. Today, we'll be talking about some advanced features available on our platform. I'm joined today by Jonathan and Angelisa, who are also support engineers at CircleCI, who will be hanging out in the chat to answer any questions y'all have during the presentation. There will be ample time at the end for a Q&A where I'll be answering any questions you may have. If we don't get to answer your question today, we'll send a follow-up email to the email address you used to register for this webinar. Additionally, we will be sending out this webinar recording after, so don't worry about having to copy the content as I move through the slide deck. Cool. Let's jump in. Maybe. There we go. Today's agenda includes how to find answers and ask for help. We'll go over executors, their use cases, and some examples, how to create and manage workflows and why they're valuable, the different methods of managing secrets inside your builds, how to create reports and persist data after a build completes using test results and artifacts. We'll talk about some optimization techniques, the CircleCI API, and then the Q&A session at the end. Let's dive into how to find answers and ask for help. The CircleCI docs are a great place to explore different concepts on CircleCI. You can find almost any information related to building on CircleCI that you would need here. Something isn't clear or missing, please reach out to the support team and let us know. We'd be happy to clarify that. The Support Center contains CircleCI's knowledge base. It's a great place to dive into for common errors and other information. In most cases, the knowledge base can be used to quickly solve most problems you'd run into. To reach the CircleCI support team, you can create a ticket directly from your CircleCI dashboard by clicking on support and then get support. Other ways you could reach us include by email, support@circleci.com, the Knowledge Center by clicking open a support ticket under the section titled Can't Find Your Answer. Our community support's available at discuss.circleci.com. Discuss is a great place to reach out to the community and find users who are doing something similar to what you're trying to accomplish. If you're interested in a specific third-party tool, library, or dependency, Discuss is an awesome resource to reach out to others and see how they're using it to build on CircleCI. Jumping into executors, the first executor is Docker images. CircleCI offers a ton of convenience images, which are language specific. Some examples are Ruby, Node, PHP, and Android. We also offer several resource class options for the Docker executor. The 5 here in the slide cover the majority of use cases. If your build requires more resources than the extra large, 16 gigs of RAM and 8 virtual CPU cores, please reach out to support. We'll be happy to help you get the resources needed to build your application. A configuration example is available on the right side. This example will print Docker into the build output window using the CircleCI node image. A couple of notes when using the Docker executor: each resource class will cost a different amount of credits. The larger the resource, the more credits that it will consume per minute. Service images such as Postgres or Redis are not available at localhost. You must use 127.0.0.1. Service images will use the same resources as the primary container. If the primary container is allocated 4 gigs of memory and you're running a Redis cache, a Postgres database, they'll share the same 4 gigabytes of memory as the primary container. In other words, it may be necessary to raise the resource class if you're building with more memory intensive services running alongside your build. The Windows executor is VM-based and isolated to your build session. It uses the server core version of Windows Server 2019 Data Center Edition. Currently, there's only 1 resource class available for Windows, but we're working to expand that in the future. Currently, you can access a VM with 15 gigabytes of memory and 4 CPU cores. There are a few different shell options for the Windows executor. You can use PowerShell by default or specify Bash or command prompt depending on your use case. Docker is also available on the Windows executor if you need to run any Windows-based Docker images. The configuration example on the right side will spin up a Windows machine and use PowerShell to write Windows in the build output window. And then more information on the Windows executor is available at circle.ci/hello windows. The machine executor is an Ubuntu-based VM, which provides application isolation, as well as access to privileged Docker commands. There are two resource classes available to use, which are medium and large. The default medium resource class will provide access to 7.5 gigabytes of memory and 2 CPU cores. The large resource class will provide 15 gigabytes of memory and 4 CPU cores. The configuration example on the right side of the slide will spin up an Ubuntu VM and Echo machine into the build output window. One caveat to using the machine executor is the spin-up time. In the Docker executor, we typically see a spin-up time of a few seconds. The machine executor can take anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds to spin up before your job will start running. The macOS executor is available for users who need to perform testing for iOS and macOS applications. The macOS executor provides access to iPhone, iPad, Apple Watch, and Apple TV simulators. We offer two resource classes available for macOS, medium and large. The default medium resource class will provide access to 8 gigabytes of memory and 4 CPU cores. The large resource class will provide 16 gigabytes of memory and 8 CPU cores. The large resource class is restricted and will require review by our support team before you can begin using it. The configuration example on the right will spin up a macOS executor using the Xcode 11.0.0 environment and print macOS in the build output window. More information on macOS is available at circle.ci/hellomac. Some best practices. It's best to use the most specific version of a Docker image possible. Our convenience images are built automatically as the upstream images are released, which means it's the release version of the image, cached locally in some CircleCI preferred tools, such as the CircleCI, CLI, SSH, and Git injected into the image. For Dockerize, if you run into any kind of race condition where the database hasn't fully spun up and the application begins running, it's good to use Dockerize to wait for a database to be available before continuing the build. The example on the slide will time out and fail after 120 seconds if the database has failed to start in that amount of time. We support most container registries. Some examples are AWS Elastic Container Registry, Docker Hub, and Quay.io. On screen are some examples on how to configure your build to use a Docker image using AWS and Quay.io with authentication. On to workflows. Some definitions when talking about workflows. Workflow is a set of rules defining how jobs such as build, test, and deploy are run, giving teams granular control over their software development process. A job is a collection of steps in an execution environment to run them in. A step is an executable command. Build is an obsolete way to mean jobs and workflows altogether. And fan out, fan in enables you to run multiple jobs in parallel for efficient version testing, and fan in to quickly deploy to multiple platforms. Some of the different types of workflows include scheduling in cron, approval, branch specific, and tag specific. Scheduling in cron allows you to define a schedule for jobs that should only run periodically, maybe a nightly build or release. An approval step provides control over the steps that may need manual approval to continue, such as deploying your application to production. Branch specific allows you to specify which branches a build should run with, and tag specific allows you to specify which tags a workflow should build with. Why workflows? Workflows allow you to decompose your build settings and write a story using end-to-end tests. It allows you to run and troubleshoot jobs independent of each other and receive real-time status feedback. It's possible to schedule workflows for jobs that should only run periodically, such as nightly builds or weekly releases. And again, workflows allows you to fan out to run multiple jobs in parallel and then fan back in to deploy to your platform of choice. Secrets management. There's a couple different places to define environment variables. Secrets can be injected in the config.yml using the environment identifier key. This can be provided at the step, job, or container level, depending on your use case. Environment variables can also be injected from the project settings, which provides a project level secret store for environment variables that your application will need to run. And then finally, contexts allow you to create a global environment variable, which are accessible to any project in the organization. When using GitHub, context also allows you to create an access control list to ensure only the necessary contributors have access to the secrets. Some gotchas when using environment variables. CircleCI doesn't support environment variable interpolation. Modifying the path variable directly will result in the default environment variables being overwritten. The solution to that is to export the variables using the bash environment, as suggested on the screen. More on environment variables being overwritten. When this happens, be sure to check the precedence order. In some cases, you might be setting the environment variables in the project settings, but overriding them in the config. Test results. Test results can be useful to determine which tests commonly fail, how long it normally takes for a test to run, and other information. Test results need to be stored in a folder. In the example, we're storing test results in the root directory /rspec. The test results also exist in this directory, the test results also exist in this directory. Don't target the file specifically. Essentially, just target the directory where you're storing all your test results in, and we'll auto load them into Insights. Speaking of Insights, after storing the test results information, such as most commonly failed tests, slowest tests, job success rate, and other information will be available in the Insights. Build optimizations. Some different caching strategies we employ are dependency caching, workspaces, artifacts, and Docker layer caching. Dependency caching is typically used to cache application dependencies between job runs. Workspaces are for data produced in a job that needs to be available to subsequent jobs within a workflow. Artifacts are for data that is available after the job finishes or after the workflow finishes. And then Docker layer caching is used when building custom Docker images on CircleCI. Again, dependency caching is commonly used for things like node modules. This will lessen the amount of network calls to third-party services. It's one of the most effective methods of build optimization and can be automatically changed by using cache keys in different environments. A common issue you may see in dependency caching, if you're building and caching on multiple executors, such as Docker and macOS, the file system and permissions could change, making the cache ineffective. Be sure to plan your caching strategy per executor for the best results. And here is an example of dependency caching. So here we restore the cache if there was one already available. And then we'll run bundle install. If there's anything missing from the restored cache based on what's defined in your project settings, it'll install any missing packages. Or if your cache doesn't exist yet, it will download all the dependencies. And then finally, we save the cache and save all those dependencies. So next time the build runs, your cache will be restored. And you don't have to rely on downloading files. Here are some of the cache keys we support. These can be used to ensure you're using the correct cache while building. The most commonly used cache key is checksum. It will gather the checksum of the file provided. In Node, you'd use the checksum of the package.json file. This way, anytime a dependency changes, a new cache will be used. Be sure to be careful when using general cache keys. In some cases, the general cache key may be out of date, and we prefer to download the newest packages instead of risking old versions of dependencies. We can force update the cache by incrementing the v1 portion of the cache key. Workspaces move data between sequential jobs in a workflow. The most common use case for this is test data. If you run high parallelization, at the end of test jobs, you want to persist that data to output one test results file. You can use Workspaces to move that data into a single job and consolidate. Here's an example of Workspaces. We echo hello world to the workspace echo output file. Persist the data using persist to workspace. Here we provide the root directory as workspace, and the path is specific to the file we want to upload, in this case, echo output. In the downstream job, we attach workspaces at TMP workspace, and the data is available there. Artifacts are used to persist data after the workflow is completed. This is most commonly used for binaries. In the case of Golang, you may want to keep the binary for later use. Using artifacts is the best way to do this. However, it's not recommended to use artifacts as a means of distribution. This is because we don't guarantee how long we'll keep the artifacts for, but they're typically available for a long time. For distribution, we recommend pushing it to your own storage provider or even pushing it back to your VCS as a tagged commit to create a release. In this example, we create a file called artifact files and store that in TMP artifacts. This file will be available from the artifacts tab of the build output window after the workflow is completed. Docker layer caching. DLC caches the individual layers of any Docker image built during your CircleCI jobs and then reuses unchanged image layers on subsequent CircleCI runs rather than rebuilding the entire image every time. In short, the less your Docker files change from commit to commit, the faster your image building steps will run. DLC can be used with setup remote Docker. DLC can be used when building Docker images on the machine executor. And DLC should only be used when building images on CircleCI. It will have no effect for day-to-day usage of a Docker image. Let's talk more about parallelism. To speed up builds using parallelism, we need to define the parallelism key with the number of containers you want the job to run with concurrently. In this example, we're running in Parallelism 4, so 4 containers will be running the job steps. You can split tests using the CircleCI CLI. In this example, we glob the tests together using CircleCI test glob and the path to the test definitions, then piping that to CircleCI test split to create a file which can be used by CircleCI to automatically distribute the tests to parallel containers. Debugging failed builds. Method for more intense troubleshooting, it's possible to SSH into the executor while your build is running. This will allow you to analyze the build in real time, debug logs, or manually trigger the build. Some common errors and mistakes on CircleCI. CircleCI will always try to build by branch first. If you don't want your build to run on sorry, jumped out of order here. So Xcode 137 is an out of memory error. If you're using a Java-based solution, one way to try to mitigate that is by setting the Java options to the amount of memory you want the application to utilize. Or you can raise the build to a higher resource class to provide more resources while the application's building. Second problem, filtered tag and workflow, but every commit is running a build. CircleCI will always try to build by branch first. If you don't want your build to run on each branch commit, but each time you release a tag, you need to define which branches to ignore. So in the example on the screen, we're ignoring all branches, but only building on commits that are tagged with CI test. Problem, push a commit, but no build happened on CircleCI. check the YAML syntax with CircleCI config validate. That's a command in the CLI. This will validate your configuration. It's not always known if there's something wrong with the if there's an issue in the configuration, we might think that maybe the project's not set up for CircleCI. Sometimes it could just be as simple as there's too many spaces, and CircleCI config validate will output that information for you. Problem, command not found. If you're attempting to use a command which is usually available in the image you're building with, but receiving command not found, check to see that you're not modifying the path environment variable directly. Moving into deployment, continuous deployment. At CircleCI, continuous integration is used to test and merge changes into the main branch as often as possible. Continuous delivery is used to deploy those changes so your users and customers can utilize the changes as fast as possible. There's a couple different ways that you can deploy on CircleCI, using the deploy step or using Orbs. We have an Orb for almost any cloud provider that you'd want to deploy to: Heroku, AWS, Azure, GCP. Pretty much all of them are supported. Approval is something that goes hand in hand with continuous delivery. In some cases, you might have processes that require approval for a deployment. We can use the approval step to prevent unwanted deployments. If you're using GitHub, it's possible to restrict who can approve a job using secure context. In the example above, we define a context in the require context job. When this context is scoped to specific users or groups, the job will fail if the approver doesn't exist in that group. Moving into APIs. Some common use cases of APIs are triggering a build at any timing or on demand, retrieving artifacts, getting project and build information, and integrating with other tools. How to use APIs. You can get an API token at circleci.com/account/API. A personal API token can be used for any write operation, such as triggering a build. A project token only has read access and can be used for things like status badges. We are starting to roll out our V2 API, which includes some things like insights data, pipelines, providing parameters to the build using pipelines parameters, and my favorite, managing project environment variables. You can find more information on the V2 API docs, which are in preview, at circleci.com/docs/API/V2. It's a long link. I will read it up for a second. Finally, we are on to the Q&A session. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to again mention that this recording will be sent out to everyone registered, as well as will be available on YouTube. So you don't need to worry about copying information down from the slides or missing a question in the Q&A. So Jonathan and Angelisa are going to help me with the Q&A. What kind of questions do the kind folks attending want to know more about?
Hi there, Scott. It's Angelisa. I'm curious, can I use multiple executor types in my config file? It's coming from a customer about executors.
Can you use multiple executors in a config file? Yes. So that's the whole purpose behind workflows. So you can create concurrent jobs that will test your application in macOS, Docker, or Linux, and Windows all at the same time. And it can build and actually produce the executable if you're using Golang, for example.
Scott, with the next one, sticking with executors, are resource classes available when using the remote Docker executor?
We don't currently offer support for resource classes on the remote Docker config item. If you check out our feature request board at ideas.circleci.com, there is a feature request for that our engineers have been interacting with. And go ahead and add your vote on there and let them know you're interested and that's something you want to see.
Awesome. As far as workflows, is it possible to trigger pull requests only in your workflows?
Yeah, absolutely. In the project settings, you can turn on only build pull requests. That setting will, as mentioned, only build pull requests and will always build the default branch. So the master branch will always build, and then only build pull requests will only build commits with a pull request attached to them.
All right, Scott, got a workflows, kind of switching gears on you. Is it possible to pause workflows that run scheduled cron jobs?
There's not direct support for pausing a workflow, but what you could do is set up an approval step and make sure that the following jobs at the point you want to approve at are required, or that the approval step is required to pass before the downstream jobs can run. But you can use an approval job to pause a workflow right in the middle of it, yeah.
What about serializing workflows? So let's say for the master branch, it does deploys, but you don't want multiple concurrent workflows to run and step over one another.
That is a little tougher of a question. So creating a serialization for workflows. So can we come back to that one? I'll think about it while I'm answering other questions. Just remind me, please.
Sure thing. Let's see here. Let's go over to a config question here. Is it possible to conditionally execute a step based on a bash command? I'm assuming they're within their build here.
Conditionally execute a step based on a bash command.
Correct.
So as long as the logic is within the bash command, you can use, I can't remember the exact syntax of the command, but it's roughly CircleCI step stop, I think. So that's a CircleCI CLI command. So as long as your logic exists in the bash command, you can set it to fail the rest of the job using that command. We have the email address of that user. I assume we can send them more information with links to the
Yeah, just some commentary and follow-up around that question. They were looking at trying to evaluate during runtime in order to negate some workarounds they have in their code. So that was kind of the idea behind that question.
Okay.
For increasing speed, do you have any suggestions for increasing the cache restore speed, either for uploading and for downloading cache?
Yeah, so the cache speed is directly related to the amount of data stored in the cache. So sometimes I've seen CircleCI users use the same cache for Node dependencies and Ruby dependencies and whatever other tools they're using building on CircleCI. So that can create kind of a large cache, and the largest cache that we recommend using is at 500 megabytes. Anything past that, we start to see corruption, and that has to do with the compression methods we use when storing everything. So the smaller the cache size, the faster it's going to download and upload on the back end. So splitting to as many distinct caches as possible is a general recommendation.
Let's see here. Let's make sure I get this correct. A attendee writes, and I'm building a Docker image and then using it in later jobs in the workflow. To speed up overall runtime, I should be looking at Docker layer cache and persist the workspace, or just send off the image to a third-party registry.
I think it would be best to send off to a third-party registry. That way that we can download it using, you could actually set it as an image within your config file. So if you set the image command to the most recent version of your image, that should always pull the one that was just built. So I would recommend sending it back to Docker Hub or whichever provider you use to host your images.
I have another question similar to storing cache, but for artifacts. How should we store artifacts? Are they configurable? How long are they stored for? Where are they stored?
So can you restate the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, so for artifacts, how are they stored in CircleCI? Are they configurable once uploading and downloading? How does that work?
Okay, so artifacts are stored. They can't be modified after they've been stored. It is like a read-only S3 bucket. I believe we store artifacts in S3. And then how long do we store them? We don't really say how long we store them for, but it's generally a long time. They'll be available for quite a while. I can't give an exact date of how long we store artifacts for right now. Did that answer all the points in that question, Angelisa?
Yeah, definitely just if they're configurable and how they're stored, which yeah, they're stored in S3, definitely.
Cool. Yeah, and then as far as configuration goes, it's mostly just storing the artifact. There's nothing else we can configure on that.
Yep, that's correct.
Here's one I know that we've kind of seen in support tickets is, can we filter jobs to run only when certain folders change? For example, if my application code doesn't change, but my test code does, can my workflows not run my deploy jobs, but run the test jobs?
Absolutely, you can build rules around this. This is one of those things where it might be more specific to how you're using CircleCI. But you can develop like branching strategies or tag strategies when you're pushing your commit that will allow a build to run only in certain instances. So for example, if your branch starts with like feature, for example, and you filter, I only want to run a certain job on branches that start with feature, you can exclude that from the deploy step so it won't run as long as your branch is prefixed with feature. If it gets a little more complex than that, I would ask to open a support ticket so we can kind of help you evaluate more options.
Thanks, Scott. Angelisa?
So this is an interesting question. Is it possible to modify my config file directly in the CircleCI UI rather than going through the git add commit push cycle in order to learn new features perhaps, or debug my problems rather than having to push each time?
No, you would have to push each time. And that's mostly because when we pull the configuration from your VCS provider, we actually pull it or clone it. So all those changes would need to happen in the VCS provider. If you're wanting to change things in a UI rather than like in your IDE, for example, you could definitely still do that from GitHub. So that's still a possibility, and then you can commit just from there and it'll kick off a build. Or Bitbucket, sorry. Either of the VCS providers support that.
Here's one in regards to user keys. Francois asks, is there a way to push tags back into GitHub without user keys? User keys are typically tied to a given user. It's been hard to figure out another way to give CircleCI write access for release tagging.
In this situation, I would recommend creating a machine user, which has access to CircleCI and your VCS provider to centralize that access. Aside from that, yeah, I think that's about the only way to get around not running that stuff as a specific user. You could run it as the machine user that's linked with CircleCI. And that would kind of isolate your credentials as well.
Of course, proper security management.
On that same thread of permissions and access for specific builds, is there a certain way we can limit certain builds to specific users? And if that is in the docs, what's the best way to get there?
Yeah, so I think the best way to handle this would be using approval steps in restricted context. Unfortunately, this won't apply to Bitbucket. Bitbucket doesn't give us the API necessary to kind of manage secure context. But so what you could do is set up approval steps wherever you'd like in the job, and then also set it to use a restricted context. That way, when a user triggers a build, they would have to go click approve. And if they're not in that group of the restricted context, the build will fail, effectively not allowing just anyone to run a build or run whatever job you want to restrict.
Awesome.
How are we on time? I wasn't watching that part because I do have a couple other questions here that are good.
Yeah, we have like 25 minutes for questions. We're all good.
Oh, perfect. This is an API question. Let me make sure I get it. Can we update context variables via API?
I don't think so the V2 API will allow you to change project environment variables. I don't think it supports context yet, but I do believe that's on the roadmap.
Yeah, I think I've heard the same.
Mm-hmm.
So back to executors, can we run GPU accelerated code on CircleCI?
Yes. I cannot give you an example off the top of my head, but we absolutely do support the GPU executor. I can't remember. I think it's restricted to Docker. And is it available in machine? Do you recall, Angelisa?
That's a good question. Let me confirm.
Okay. So we do offer GPU accelerated code. The environments that those are available in, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Well, Angelisa's on that one. How about pipelines? Get Dan here with pipelines. Can I pass parameters that I don't plan on using in the build? For example, to identify the build in our build systems that I can use to post information back.
So if you're wanting to pass parameters with the commit, it would be best to use the V2 API. You can provide parameters into the build, and then they're just set up as, you can access them with pipelines.parameters.your variable name. And then you can just use that to post back to your build system. If you're running the build based on commit, then it gets a little more difficult. Maybe you can include a text file that a later step would read from and then post to your tracking system. What else we got?
I just responded to the GPU question with our docs to the types of resource classes. We do have GPU small, medium, and large for our Linux VMs, so just machine.
Cool. Thank you for clarifying that.
Let's look at what other questions we've got. So this is a great question. I still don't understand what an orb is. So maybe Scott, if you want to kind of go over a general overview of why we love orbs.
Yes, orbs are fantastic. I love orbs. So there was a scenario a while back where when you run your build on CircleCI, you would want to post information about your build maybe to your Slack channel. So you can quickly follow up and react to whatever the situation is. So what we would do as developers, we would write bash code to run a curl request against the Slack channel. And that would exist in a ton of different places in your configuration. It wasn't very intuitive or easy to read. So we created Orbs as a reusable config option. You can think of it more as a library. So you can develop a library which takes common variables such as your API key and what URL to post data to. And then you provide that to the Orb as almost a command, and it'll allow you to post into your Slack channel. And CircleCI offers a great Slack orb, by the way. But there are tons of orbs out there that do a ton of different things. They're essentially libraries that let you have an easier time deploying to Heroku or AWS, installing configuration tools such as AWS CLI. And then there's a ton of notification-based orbs based on whichever service you use. So overall, orbs are a great tool that you can effectively think of as a library. And we have a great community who's developing tons of orbs, and CircleCI is also publishing our own orbs on popular platforms. What else we got?
Can I actually piggyback an orb question, another one specific to the CLI? So this question's interesting because they say it seems the CLI does not fully support orbs. For example, in order to process my config, I have to first pack the orbs into a config file with the config pack command and then run it. So is there any plan to support orbs as first-class citizens, as I ask?
So the best way to, so the unpacked config is not necessarily supported on CircleCI. You couldn't just run a unpacked config. What it does is create a modular environment for you to easier write and understand the code. So packing the configuration before running against the CLI is a necessary step. There's no way to negate that.
And sticking just one more with the orb thread here we have going. Peter asks, so can we write our own custom orbs?
Absolutely. Orbs are fantastic. If you, Jonathan, if you could provide them with the link to the orbs page. There's two different sections on there. One of them is creating your own orb and the other's using orbs. We have great documentation around creating orbs, and well, every orb's open source, so you can pretty much just download any orb and look at examples and see how people are doing things. And the orb registry also has a ton of different orbs on it. But yes, absolutely, you can develop your own orbs.
Yeah, I knew how passionate you are about them, which is why I'm like, I got to put this question out there for you.
I love orbs, and I love making orbs, and I love people who make orbs.
I think we need an orb office hours because I've got another orb question for you.
Okay.
So we currently use the AWS orb for deployment. Is there a way to use the orb without having to reinstall the AWS CLI for every build?
That's a tough question, and I wish I had a better answer for it, but not really. I'm not entirely familiar with the AWS CLI and what happens at the operating system level. If it's just a binary, you could persist, or you could store that as a dependency cache and move it over as you need. But if it actually modifies, I'm thinking of Windows land here, the registry or the path, those are manual steps you'd have to take if you persist the binary. But if it's an actual installation process, you'll have to install it each time it runs.
I was just quickly scanning to see if we had any other kind of orb related questions we could throw in here.
Yeah, orbs are fantastic.
Angelisa, do you see any?
I don't see any. I'm scrolling right now for orbs. If people do ask, we'll definitely look out for them, but I don't see any right now.
Okay, just kind of since we're on that thread. Let's see.
Yeah.
What else we have? Oh, here's a good one. So kind of stepping away from orbs for a moment. With workflows, how would you recommend structuring your workflow when you need to make a test matrix without massive duplication?
Test matrix without massive duplication. I assume that means you're running thousands of tests and you want to parallelize it.
That's kind of how I'm reading it. Yeah.
Okay, so if you're running tons of tests, the best way to do it is again using the CircleCI CLI to glob and split your tests, and then we have great documentation on this. I might be missing a step here, and I apologize if I did too. But so essentially, you're going to use the CircleCI CLI to make all your tests into one file, and then it'll split it out based on whatever parameters you want to, like how long a test takes to run. You can kind of split based on that. And then you can run it as pretty much as much parallelism as you want. And then you can fan your workflow back in as long as you're persisting that test data to a workspace. And then once you fan back into that single job, you can consolidate and upload everything using store test results or to your test result analytics engine.
I also just pasted in the chat a Discuss page article that one of our engineers, Alex Engelberg, posted. We just created matrix job syntax, so you can also run a matrix job now on CircleCI if that's also helpful for your use case.
What else we got? Any more questions?
Got an Orb workflow question here. Is it possible to have multiple runs of the same Orb job within the same workflow?
Am I understanding that correctly?
Same
So
Orb job.
you want to run the same job a bunch of times. Is that right? And maybe in different execution environments or something?
Kind of how that's all they wrote in this question from Andrew. If you want to expand on it, you can definitely drop in another question, but that's typically how I see customers trying to negotiate that.
Yeah, so there's a couple different options. So if you have common parameters that you would run in a job, you could use YAML anchors to define kind of reusable pieces of config. If it is literally the same job running over and over again, you could just redefine that job with different names and then specify all those names in the workflow, and it would run everything at the same time. I hope I understood and answered the question all the way.
This is a question about context, more so a recommendation on how to create them and in what way is best. So how is it a good approach to create context per environment or one per sec, pre-prod, prod? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I would absolutely create them based on environment. Your production credentials are usually different than pre-prod or staging. Or your development test. So as you're deploying to those different areas in your config, you would likely define if this workflow matches this condition, we're going to deploy to production. So when you use that deploy to production, you would scope that context to production instead of using maybe different environment variable names. That way you can keep your application consistent. So yeah, I would definitely recommend creating different contexts per environment.
I see Chris had put one question in the chat, and actually this is one I saw in a support tick earlier this week. In the old UI experience, it is possible to get a view of the status of all workflows in one page. Will this be possible in the new UI experience? We have around 50 workflows, and the new experience UI is not workable for us because we cannot see the current workflow status of all 50 in one page. Instead, we need to select the switcher 50 times. Do you know this? I asked Kate specifically about this. So I think you got the same info I do.
I might not have the same info you do. If you kind of want to answer that, as far as I know, I think we're going to be working towards a solution to that, but right now we don't have one. Is that?
Yeah, it's in flight right now. The design team is definitely aware of it,
Okay.
understanding that it's a use of our customer base in the old UI. So
Yeah, Kate is our UI product manager, by the way, and would love your feedback on the new UI. If you have any feedback on the new UI, Kate would love to hear it. And you can write into support.CircleCI to provide that feedback. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. What questions do we have?
All right, let's see. This one's interesting regarding workspaces and dependency management. Can a workspace be used for dependency management to avoid caching large dependencies, for example?
So just to be clear, workspaces are meant to be used within a workflow. So if you have job A, job B, and job C running in a workflow, you would persist data using workspaces to all three of those. Maybe job A builds a Golang binary, and that'll be available to job B and C. But yes, you can cache your dependencies across workspaces, but you'd have to include manual steps to restore them to the correct directories. In general, I would recommend the save underscore cache and restore underscore cache dependency caching to move any kind of like library dependency, such as like node modules or something. What else do we have?
I was just looking at one in regards to workflows, very much along the same thread. Just yeah, I want to reduce the running time of my workflows. Most of the time most of the time it's been used to download dependencies. Yeah. My question would be, is there a way to cache dependencies and then attach them to the build container? So that was.
Yeah, the dependency caching strategy, save underscore cache and restore underscore cache to cache your dependencies is the best way to speed up your builds. It's one of the most popular optimization techniques we offer.
Can you explain incrementing cache keys for those who don't know what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no way to delete a cache or modify the cache after it's already been saved. So we usually recommend adding a portion of your cache key with like B1. So what that does is if you happen to gain a corrupt cache and you can't get it to move forward, and since we can't delete it, the best way to get a new cache is by making it stale. So what we'll do is increment that V1 to V2 or V2 to V3 or as much as you need to go up to basically reset the cache and create a whole new caching environment.
Awesome, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
On the deployment side, so is there a way to deploy to AWS by assuming a role rather than using AWS access keys?
I cannot answer that off the top of my head. I want to say using the Orb, that would be possible. But without looking at some AWS documentation, I'm not familiar off the top of my head. If you want to write in to support@circleci.com, we could look into that for you. Got roughly 5 minutes left. Any more questions?
This one's interesting. So in terms of building containers, I think there's another question. So let me just make sure I group it together. But just in terms of Okay, building Docker images. Um, can we use Parallelism to build Docker images? And if yes, will Docker be built from scratch in another container? I saw another question similar to this, and I don't know if it has been answered, but kind of differentiating building containers versus using Docker layer caching, and kind of when we would use one or the other to build our own versus persisting layers or Docker layers.
Okay, so Docker layer caching should only be used in the instance that you're building containers on CircleCI. And that would be you spin up either a remote Docker environment or you're using the machine executor. And then you're building the Docker image. Docker layer caching saves those layers to persist them to the next job. Can you remind me the first part of that question, Angelisa?
Yeah, I mean there's quite a bit going on there, but really just if you were to use Parallelism to build Docker images, if that's possible, what that would look like, and if it builds new containers from scratch each time.
Yeah, if you were to use Parallelism to build a Docker image, it would just build the same container several times. It's not really possible to parallelize the actual Docker build process, as in like you can't build layer 1 and 2 in one container and layer 2 in another. Like they'll have to be built at the same time. So to get faster build times on Docker containers, I would recommend raising the resource class. The more resources you provide it, the better, or the faster it's going to build. And then, of course, the machine executor, it's possible to raise the resource class on using remote Docker. You're not going to be able to raise the resource class on that for right now.
Okay, awesome. That was going to be my next question. So we can't use resource class for remote Docker, but we can for machine and the Docker containers, but not remote Docker. Cool.
Correct.
I've got two quick questions here. One, can CircleCI support a custom branch other than the default branch to always build when we enable only build with open PR, open pull request?
No, we only support the default branch. If you're asking like if maybe your default branch has changed, maybe you're not using the master branch as your default branch, but the development branch. If you update your default branch on GitHub, we'll receive that notification and that'll become your default branch on CircleCI. But if you want to specify maybe a second branch that only build PRs won't affect, then that's not possible currently. But if that's something you would like to see at CircleCI, open a feature request at ideas.circleci.com. Have roughly 2 minutes left, maybe time for one more question.
Do you have any other
Angela,
questions,
you got one?
Jonathan? Yeah, I'm looking right now.
I have the one that it's only because I think it's the only Mac OS environment question we've had. Is like, does CircleCI support parallel runs for simulators on Mac OS?
I don't know. I don't work very closely with Mac OS. That's not something I would be able to answer, but we do have a couple folks on the team who would be able to answer that. If you could open a support ticket, we could get you in touch with the right people.
Thank you, Scott.
Mm-hmm. There was that question that I asked to jump back to, Angelisa.
Yeah, so I posted as a response, we do have a feature request open to sequentially run jobs in a branch. I can post it in the chat as well, but this I think would definitely beneficial. And it looks like Brian Beck also made a recommendation for that, saying, I use the checkbox in advanced project settings for this canceling concurrent builds per branch to avoid this. If I push a new commit on the same branch where my workflow is already running, it will cancel the running workflow and start the new one. So depending on exactly what you're doing, that feature request or the option of canceling redundant builds might be beneficial for you.
Yes, the auto cancel redundant builds. I think the question was worded in a weird way that threw me off, but auto cancel redundant builds is a great way to prevent redundant builds from going. If you make a lot of changes to your application, you only want to build the most recent changes. So auto cancel redundant builds will cancel any builds that are running previously on the branch, and then it will also it will not ever stop any builds running on the default branch, which is typically the master branch. But yeah, if it gets a little more complex than that, then we would ask to open a support ticket so we can better address it. Is that all the questions? We are right at time.
We have a few others that are just kind of trickling here and there, but as we did last time, we can address those after the webinar. And
cool. Yep. If we weren't able to get to your question today, we will reach out to you via the email address you signed up for at the that you used to sign up for the webinar. It was great answering all these questions today and presenting to you. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.